Ever wondered what happens when you grab a red-hot piece of metal? In medieval times, that could determine whether you went free or faced execution. Number 6. Hot iron ordeal. During the Middle Ages, justice wasn't served with DNA evidence or surveillance footage. Instead, many communities relied on divine intervention through brutal physical tests called ordeals. When evidence was lacking, these painful procedures were believed to reveal guilt or innocence through supernatural means. The hot iron ordeal was among the most common and excruciating tests. The accused would be required to carry a piece of iron heated in fire for a specific distance, usually 9 feet. The iron might be shaped as a bar, ring, or plowshare, and after completing the terrifying task, the suspect's hand would be bandaged. 3 days later came the moment of truth. Court officials would unwrap the bandages to examine the burn. A clean wound showing signs of healing. Congratulations, God had protected you, proving your innocence. But if the burn appeared infected or unclean, you were deemed guilty because God had allowed the iron to reveal your sinful nature. What's particularly fascinating is that this ordeal wasn't reserved for commoners. In 1043, Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward the Confessor, faced accusations of having an improper relationship with Bishop Aelfwine of Winchester. To prove her innocence, historical accounts claim she walked barefoot over 9 red-hot plowshares placed on the cathedral floor, emerging miraculously unharmed. The hot iron ordeal appeared throughout Europe with different variations. In some regions, the accused might be required to walk on hot plowshares or retrieve an object from a cauldron of boiling water. Religious preparation always preceded the ordeal, including fasting, prayer, and blessing of the items involved. By the 13th century, these ordeals began falling out of favor. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals, effectively ending their legitimacy, as the Church's blessing was considered essential for the divine judgment to work properly. Number 5. Trial by cold water. Would you sink or float if thrown into a body of water with your hands and feet bound? Your medieval life might have depended on the answer. The cold water ordeal was based on a peculiar belief: pure water would reject the guilty but accept the innocent. When someone faced accusations of crimes like witchcraft, theft, or murder without sufficient evidence, communities might turn to this watery test. Here's how it worked. After religious ceremonies and prayers, the accused would be bound with ropes, sometimes in a fetal position with the right thumb tied to the left toe and the left thumb to the right toe. They would then be lowered into a body of blessed water, a pond, river, or lake. Counterintuitively, sinking was considered a sign of innocence. If the water accepted you and you sank, you were declared not guilty, though you might still drown if not pulled out quickly enough. However, if you floated, the water was rejecting your sinful body, and you were pronounced guilty. Officials would then pull you out for formal punishment, which might include execution. This ordeal was particularly common for those accused of witchcraft. The reasoning followed that since witches had renounced their baptism, water, the medium of baptism, would reject them. This resulted in the infamous witch ducking that continued well into the 17th century. During the Viking period in England, this ordeal featured an interesting variation. The accused would be tied to a rope and thrown into a body of water. A knot would be made in the rope at a specific distance, and if the person sank deep enough for the knot to go underwater, they were considered innocent. One historical account from 1209 describes a man named Gaspatrick who was accused of theft and subjected to the cold water ordeal. Despite being a large man who would normally be expected to float, witnesses reported that he sank like a stone, leading to his acquittal. The cold water ordeal declined after the 1215 Fourth Lateran Council, but experienced a troubling revival during the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. Even more disturbing, variations of this swimming test for witches continued in some rural areas until the early 19th century. Number 4. Trial by combat. Can't settle a dispute. Why not fight to the death? That's exactly what medieval judicial combat proposed. Trial by combat represented one of the most dramatic forms of medieval ordeal, based on the belief that God would strengthen the arm of the innocent party and reveal truth through battle. Unlike other ordeals that tested individuals against elements like fire or water, this pitted accuser against accused in physical combat. The practice originated with Germanic tribes and became integrated into various European legal systems by the Middle Ages. In England, it arrived with the Norman conquest in 1066, while continental European kingdoms had well-established rules for these encounters. Not just anyone could demand combat. The privilege typically belonged to free men of fighting age, though there were exceptions. Women, the elderly, and those with disabilities could hire champions to fight in their place. Clergy were generally exempt, having the right to be tried by ecclesiastical courts instead. The formalities surrounding judicial combat were elaborate. Before the duel, both parties would swear oaths affirming the righteousness of their cause. They would attend Mass where their weapons might be blessed. The accused would swear innocence while the accuser affirmed the truth of their accusation, with both acknowledging that God would determine the outcome. What's particularly interesting is the equipment regulation. Combatants typically fought with shield and baton rather than lethal weapons, though knights might use full armor and weapons when fighting each other. Commoners often fought with wooden clubs and leather shields in a sand-filled arena, with their bodies greased to prevent grappling. The duel ended when one party died, admitted guilt, or was forced beyond the boundary of the fighting area. In some regions, a fight lasting until sunset without clear victory would result in the accused being declared innocent. One famous example occurred in 1386 between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in France. De Carouge accused Legris of raping his wife while he was away. With no witnesses besides his wife, de Carouge demanded trial by combat. The king allowed it, and in a brutal fight witnessed by thousands, de Carouge killed Legris, vindicating his wife's claim according to the standards of the time. Though officially discontinued in most places by the 16th century, trial by combat remained technically legal in England until 1819, when a murder defendant named Abraham Thornton demanded it, causing Parliament to abolish the practice for good. Number 3. Trial by cross. How long could you stand with your arms outstretched like Jesus on the cross? Your guilt or innocence might have depended on it. The trial by cross represents one of the less physically dangerous but still challenging medieval ordeals. Unlike trials involving hot iron or drowning, this test relied on physical endurance rather than pain tolerance or divine intervention through bodily harm. The procedure was relatively straightforward, yet mentally and physically demanding. The accused and accuser would stand before the altar in a church with their arms extended sideways, forming a cross position in imitation of Christ's crucifixion. They remained this way during a lengthy religious service or while priests recited specific passages. The first person whose arms dropped or who adjusted their position was declared the loser. If the accused lost, they were pronounced guilty. If the accuser couldn't maintain the position as long as the accused, the defendant was declared innocent. Simple as that. This ordeal gained popularity because it didn't permanently harm participants while still creating significant discomfort. Try holding your arms out for even 10 minutes. The burning sensation becomes nearly unbearable. Now imagine maintaining this position for hours during a church service. Charlemagne, the great Frankish king who ruled much of Western Europe in the early 9th century, actually preferred this ordeal over more brutal alternatives. In his Capitularies legislative acts, he specifically endorsed the trial by cross while prohibiting the trial by combat, considering it more humane and still effective at determining divine judgment. One recorded case from 775 CE involved a property dispute between Bavarian monasteries. Representatives from each monastery participated in the cross ordeal, with the monastery whose representative endured longer being granted the disputed land. Interestingly, the church eventually banned this ordeal not primarily for humanitarian reasons, but because it was considered irreverent to imitate Christ's suffering for legal purposes. Pope Stephen V specifically prohibited the practice, calling it a mockery of Christ's passion. Number 2, cursed morsel ordeal. Could a piece of bread or cheese determine if you're a criminal? In medieval courts, sometimes your ability to swallow was all that stood between you and punishment. The cursed morsel ordeal, sometimes called the coarsened or trial by blessed bread and cheese, represents one of the strangest yet psychologically ingenious methods of determining guilt in medieval times. It relied on the power of fear and guilt rather than physical endurance or tolerance for pain. Here's how it worked. A priest would place a piece of bread or cheese, usually barley bread and goat cheese, on the altar during Mass, blessing it with specific prayers asking God to reveal the truth. The morsel would then be given to the accused person to eat, typically after they had sworn to their innocence. If the accused could swallow the bread or cheese without difficulty, they were considered innocent. However, if they choked, couldn't swallow, or showed visible difficulty, this was taken as divine confirmation of guilt. The psychological pressure was immense. Guilty individuals, believing in divine judgment, often struggled to swallow due to anxiety, effectively revealing themselves. The ritual included dramatic priestly pronouncements like, "May this morsel cause your throat to close if you have committed this crime." Imagine trying to swallow under such pressure. The test exploited what modern psychologists would recognize as the physical manifestations of guilt and fear. This ordeal was particularly common in Anglo-Saxon England, where it was called coarsened, literally meaning cursed morsel. Church records from the 10th century contain detailed instructions for priests conducting this ordeal, including specific prayers and procedures. One famous historical example involves Godwin, Earl of Wessex and father of the future King Harold II of England. In 1051, when accused of involvement in the murder of Alfred Atheling, brother of Edward the Confessor, Godwin reportedly declared, "May this morsel be my last if I am guilty of this crime." According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he swallowed the bread without issue and was declared innocent. The psychological power of this ordeal shouldn't be underestimated. Medieval people genuinely believed that God would intervene, causing the guilty to choke. This belief created a self-fulfilling prophecy where guilty parties, overwhelmed by fear and conscience, often struggled to swallow, essentially convicting themselves. Number 1, boiling water ordeal. How much do you trust your hand? Enough to plunge it into boiling water to prove your innocence. The boiling water ordeal, known in Latin as judicium aequi ferventis, represents one of the most physically challenging tests used in medieval justice systems. Like other ordeals, it operated on the principle that God would protect the innocent from harm while allowing the guilty to suffer. The procedure began with religious preparations. The accused would fast, pray, and confess their sins. A priest would bless a cauldron of water and heat it until it boiled. Then came the moment of truth. The accused had to reach into the bubbling water to retrieve an object, typically a stone, ring, or coin, placed at a specified depth. After the retrieval, similar to the hot iron ordeal, the hand would be bandaged and examined after 3 days. A cleanly healing wound indicated innocence, while infection or severe damage pointed to guilt. The depth of the object determined the severity of the test, with 3 classifications: to the wrist for minor accusations, to the elbow for more serious charges, and to the shoulder for the most severe crimes. This ordeal appeared throughout Europe and was particularly common in Germanic legal codes. The Salic law of the Franks, dating from the early 6th century, contains specific instructions for conducting this test, indicating its ancient origins. What makes this ordeal particularly fascinating is its psychological component. Court officials knew that reaching into boiling water would cause severe burns regardless of guilt or innocence. But the interpretation of how those burns healed allowed for significant discretion. This created a system where community standards and existing suspicions could influence the outcome, despite the seemingly objective nature of the test. One recorded case from 876 CE in Regensburg, Germany, describes a servant accused of stealing valuable items from his master. Having failed to find witnesses to confirm his innocence, he requested the boiling water ordeal. Historical accounts claim he retrieved the stone from the boiling cauldron and showed no injury after 3 days, leading to his acquittal and restoration of his reputation. The ordeal of boiling water was sometimes combined with other elements. In some regions, the water would be blessed and exorcised to ensure that no demonic interference could skew the results. In others, holy relics might be placed in the water, increasing its spiritual potency and allegedly making the divine judgment even more accurate. Like other ordeals, this practice declined after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 prohibited clergy participation. Without priestly blessing, the ritual lost its divine authority. However, references to this ordeal appear in cultural practices well beyond the Middle Ages, showing how deeply the concept of physical trials revealing spiritual truth penetrated medieval consciousness. Would you have survived any of these ordeals? Or more importantly, would these brutal tests have revealed your true nature? As shocking as these practices seem today, they represented genuine attempts to find justice in an age before forensic science, when divine intervention seemed the most reliable judge of character. The real question isn't whether these methods determined guilt accurately, it's what our own justice system might look like to people 1,000 years in the future. Will they find our methods equally barbaric or misguided in their own way?